Welcome, everyone, to the Business Schools for Climate Leadership webinar on the latest IPCC report and climate leadership, the risks and opportunities. I'm Mariah Besharov, Professor of Organizations and Impact at Saïd Business School, University of Oxford, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Business Schools for Climate Leadership is a collaboration across 8 leading European business schools who joined together in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow in November 2021 to help business leaders combat the climate crisis facing the planet. As educators and researchers, as well as leading voices and communities of influential alumni bodies, we're working together to incite, support, and mobilize our many stakeholders to protect humanity. Today's conversation focuses on climate leadership risks and opportunities, and in particular on the role of governments and business and leadership across these sectors. I'm joined in the conversation by 2 colleagues from across the 3 schools that are co-organizing today's conversation: IMD, Cambridge Judge Business School, and Oxford Saïd. From IMD, I'm joined by Knut Hannes, Professor of Strategy and London Sustainability Chair. Knut's research and teaching focus on strategy, sustainability, strategic renewal, and business models. He's co-author of the best-selling book, Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, a TED speaker, and until recently, Dean of the Global Leadership Institute at the World Economic Forum. Knut is also a former senior partner and global leader of the strategy practice at Boston Consulting Group. In conversation with Knut and myself will be Kamir Mohadis. Kamir is an associate professor in economics and policy at Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, where he's also a fellow in economics at King's College. Kamir also holds a number of other esteemed affiliations at research and policy institutes globally, including at the Economic Research Forum, at the Energy Policy Research Group, and many others. His research focuses on applied macroeconomics, global and national econometric modeling, energy economics, and climate change. Welcome to both of you, and welcome to all of you in the audience. We look forward to the discussion. And now over to you, Kamir.
Thank you very much, Mariah. So thanks for joining us today. I'm just going to take a very macro view on things to set the stage, and then Knut and Mariah will dive deeper into a particular area. So let me just start off by saying, I think the obvious thing, which is we have all become very concerned with climate change, whether it's about the planet still being around, or whether it's about impacts on individuals, impacts on firms, and impacts on households. So, but actually the relationship between climate and the economy has been discussed for many centuries. And as far as I can tell, it goes back to the 14th century, Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, and also in the, Montesquieu's Spirits of Laws, etc., etc. But the first really micro level study was done by Huntington. It's a really fascinating piece of work. It's called Civilization and Climate. And let me show you what it tries to do. It tries to actually link economic activity or human activity to deviations of temperatures above what we are used to, but also below what we used to. So when we talk about climate change, I think most of us would think about rising temperatures. While it's true that temperatures are obviously rising over time, along that path, we'll have high volatility of both temperature and precipitation. So in other words, we'll have few years which are colder than usual. We also have years which are warmer than usual. So what Huntington does is he goes into the bottom 3 lines. He goes into cigar makers in Tampa, 2 different years, and he looks at productivity of the factories. And what you sort of can tell is at the 0 degree line, this is what the workers are used to. Their productivity is sort of optimal. If the temperatures go above what they're used to or below what they're used to, the productivity and activity falls. And what that basically means is that they produce less output. There's less revenue for the firms. Profit of firms are affected. workers might be affected by firms laying off workers, etc., etc. So there is a massive impact on economic activity if you sort of aggregate it. And that really led to me and colleagues at the IMF, USC, and a number of other institutions to look at the economic impacts of climate change. And what actually the highlight of my career was Fox News covering our work. And, it's not usually you don't say that, but this was not only that Fox sort of reported that climate change is bad, or at least reported on climate change, but he said it was bad and it was bad for the United States. So let me just give you a very high level of what we find, and I think goes to motivate the rest of the webinar, is in the sense that climate change is not just an issue for poor and hot countries. Climate change affects rich and cold countries pretty much as it does to poor and hot countries. And climate change is not just an issue for the agricultural sector. What we show is that climate change impacts all sorts of sectors, going from retail to wholesale, going to mining, construction, etc., transportation, etc. So climate change, the impact of climate change is widespread across the whole globe, but across all sectors. And that really tells us that we, in terms of what we need to do to address issues related to climate change, we need to take a much more holistic view. And the other issue, I suppose, important thing that comes out of our work is that climate change actually impacts productivity growth. It's not just that it's a one-off change in economic activity. It keeps damaging economic growth. And if you compound this over many, many decades, this becomes a very, very large number. So just to show you what we sort of get is you get a map of the world, and in this map, everything is red. The darker the red, the more it affects your economy. Climate change affects your economy, and this is under no mitigation scenario. So doing nothing about climate change is clearly not, it's not up for discussion. We certainly need to do something about issues related to climate change, mitigation and adaptation. Let me go to the second point I like to make, is that so climate change is going to reduce productivity growth. But the problem is, in advanced economies at least, what we call the productivity puzzle, is that we have already seen productivity growth reducing across advanced economies. So this is showing you UK, Europe, excluding UK, and the United States. And what you see is that it's sort of the growth rates are falling. In other words, living standards are improving, but at a slower rate. And this is a big problem, because some economists argue that maybe it is the case that we are running out of ideas, the techno-pessimistic approach or techno-optimistic approach, saying, no, ideas, more ideas will come and productivity will pick up. But there's two things happening. Climate change is reducing our economic productivity, and we have also seen it reduced over several decades now. All right, so what can we do about it? Well, I suppose the question really is, can innovation, and particularly green innovation, address both of these issues? So can it lead to breakthroughs in terms of environmental breakthroughs, and can it also lead to higher productivity and future economic prosperity and higher economic productivity? And again, there are two main approaches to this. One approach is to reduce emissions and to reach net zero targets, which we hear a lot about. We can either follow the path of sort of degrowth, which is basically scale down our consumption, scale down our production, scale down our economic activity, which I don't think is the right solution, because it has unintended consequences, in particular for poor and developing and emerging economies. The second approach is to think about, can green-related investments actually lead to decarbonization? And can decarbonization policies further exacerbate green innovation? And through that, can we see real impact on the environment, but also on sustained economic growth? And I'm going to show you a few slides now to basically argue that the only way to do this, there are many ways, but one way, and I think the main way to do this, I mean, private sector is clearly key here, but private sector, there needs to be incentives, and there needs to be clear regulations, and we need governments basically to actively encourage R&D in this area. and governments need to actually actively invest in this area. So, and that's the only way that I see that we can drive both economic growth and reduce carbon emissions. So let me give you one example and then show you the results of that. First of all, we show that green innovation actually can lead to better economic outcomes, so higher productivity. And it's not just in particular areas. This is what this shows you. This is a study that we did with KPMG. It shows you that actually it leads to an increase in productivity, whether it's in adaptation, building, waste management, transportation. Where we haven't really got enough investment, and this is really key, is basically carbon capture technologies and mitigations related to ICT. There we don't really see economic benefits. In other words, we haven't had enough investment, but we've had quite a lot of investment in buildings and adaptations and energy generation. And why have we had this sort of increase in innovation in this area? And it's really not a technological miracle, because we've had access to wind and solar. So wind we've had for 1,000 years, and solar we've had it probably since the 50s, when we sent the first satellites up, which were powered by solar energy. So it's been incremental innovations, not been these massive innovations in solar and wind, but actually those have been facilitated by government subsidies in Europe in particular, and investment by the Obama administration. So post financial crisis, while patents in all other fields were dropping, green innovation and green patents were actually increasing. So this what I suppose I'm trying to say, that incentives really matter, okay? And this has really led to real innovation and real actually drop in the price of renewable energies. So if we want to transition, we basically need renewable. But if we're going to use renewables need to be cost effective. And what we've seen over the last decade is that renewables, solar and wind in particular, has become very much competitive with fossil fuel energies. Okay. And I suppose the final point I like to make is that the reason this wind and solar have become competitive is really down to technological innovation. The bulk of it is technological innovation and learning by doing. And again, that was facilitated by government subsidies and in Europe, and incentives and investment in the United States. So just to sum up, the costs associated with climate change at the macro level are substantial, at the sectoral level are substantial. And in order to reduce emissions, but also maintain economic growth, we really need to start investing in green innovation. And we need to facilitate the private sector's investment in green innovation, and governments play a huge role in this.
Thank you, Kamer. I love your perspective, because you show us a way, and that's what we need, right? We need to find the way through this. And quick comment at the beginning here. I think, like many of us, I've been following the work and publications of the IPCC now over the last years more and more closely. It's very convincing and very depressing, both. And I think just three ingoing observations. First one would be, can we make changes before we have to? We know that we will make changes, but the real question is, can we proactively make the changes needed on climate? Second observation is, we are moving, and you showed some of that, Kamer. We're moving, but we're moving way too slowly without the power that's needed. Third observation would be, business will have to be a large part of the solution, but not in isolation. Business needs carrots and sticks. Without it, it won't really move. It will move at its own pace, which is really what we see today. So we will get to solutions and we will see transformations, but the real change that's needed now is clear carrots and stick, and that's something that has to come through government action as well. Business will transform, and I just want to share a simple picture of the transformation of business. I think many of us have spent a lot of time thinking about the left-hand side here. You know, the need for change, the strategies that are needed, the drivers and the business models, even the business case, how we make the strategic transformation. I think a lot of attention should now go into the right-hand side, which is the leadership aspect of climate change. How do we lead? How do we show courage? How do we drive changes in systems? And how do we make these two happen at the same time? I think companies will increasingly transform as a consequence of climate because it offers huge opportunities, but it also offers enormous risks of not acting. And that transformation will have to be both sides. The left-hand side, the strategic imperative, the right-hand side, the leadership imperative. We see companies moving. These are just 3 examples. There are many, and in our joint report, we identified lots of examples. But just take a few. I think we need to look at the commitments and the actions of companies. And Maersk, in my opinion, is a good one. I mean, making a decisive move into zero emission shipping. It's not easy, but it will have enormous impact if it's something that catches on. Similarly, Royal DSM, another good example, looking much more at the food systems. And I think Nestlé and others looking at how do we adapt to the consumer changes. And I used to say that the 2 actors missing in action in the game of sustainability and climate were investors and consumers. That's simply no longer true. Both are becoming more and more important by the day. So I think there are 4 important questions for us, and we can discuss them. One is time compression. How can we do the things we do, but much faster? That's really what's needed. And then the changes that we're going through will have serious social consequences. How do we make sure that we actually address this in a just way, which is, to me, the big global challenge, but it's also a huge challenge for each company. Third one, circular economy. I mean, the opportunity here is huge. And looking back at today in 50 years, I think we would be shocked by the waste that's produced in today's economy. So one of the big quests is really for us to build circular systems in all industries. Last one, system collaboration. And Mariah, you will talk a little bit about that. I think this is a team sport. We will have to work together. Most of the big solutions that are needed require courage. They require companies to transform, but they also require systems and collaboration across industries, in supply chains, public, private, etc. So there's a way here, come here. And it has a lot to do with what you said, technology. It has a lot to do with governments. And then it has a lot to do with business stepping up. Last point would be my perspective, and that's really what you said as well, Kamir. I think we will be very positively surprised by new technologies, current technology scaling, and startups being much greener than the startups of 30 years ago. So I'll stop there and we can continue in the discussions. Mariah.
Thank you, Knut. I'm going to pick up on where you left off really and talk about the leadership challenges associated with addressing those 4 critical challenges and the kinds of business transformation that you were talking about. And in particular, both sides of that image, the left and the right, not just the strategy side, but really the purpose side as well. So let me start off here by talking about what I see as the organizational leadership challenge, which is both true in large firms and in small startups. And I know we're going to talk in the Q&A about both, and we've already heard about both in Kamir and Knut's comments. Really, the challenge for leaders in organizations, whether they're startup, wind energy ventures, or large established oil and gas firms, is about managing what often seem to be competing demands of profit, right, the historic focus, and now of purpose and sustainability. And this can show up in many ways in terms of strategic choices, research allocation, as well as the motivation of employees and the basis for their commitment to the organization. And I'm a scholar of leadership and organizations and have studied this both in the context of sustainability and climate action, but also in the context of many other social issues that firms and businesses are increasingly trying to address. And what I want to highlight is that in addressing the organizational leadership challenge of sustainability, of business transformation towards sustainable futures, we can think about 3 critical practices that leaders and organizations can start to adopt. The first, on the left of the slide here, represented by the yin-yang image, is really a mindset, sort of how do we think about the problem? How do we understand the challenge ahead? And I talk about this as a both-and mindset. We need to be thinking not about sustainability versus business or purpose versus profits, but purpose and profits, sustainability through business and business success through sustainability. And if we shift the way we start to think about the challenge ahead, it's the first step towards unlocking more creative and flexible ways of organizing, ways of acting, both as individuals, but especially as organizations, that can point us towards the kinds of innovative solutions that Knut and Kamir have called for and noted. The second piece, complementing the mindset piece, is what I call guardrails, and this is really a structural piece. Some of this may be government incentives, right? We have very strong guardrails in firms around profit and financial success. We have much weaker guardrails, incentives, structures, goals, metrics, means of holding firms and ourselves accountable, much weaker guardrails around sustainability, and we really need to strengthen them. And we capture that here with the thickening arrows. We see signs of this, but we need much more. And this has got to come not just from government, from outside firms, but really also from within. And then the third piece is the ability to experiment and adapt, to make dynamic decisions, because we don't have all the solutions now, right? And especially as we think about the transformation required in large established firms, we need to cultivate and celebrate the ability to experiment, to learn, to fail, to revisit, and to adapt. Because the kinds of solutions that we need aren't all known now. And that's especially hard to cultivate that kind of approach to decision making and to action in large established firms, but absolutely critical. So these are 3 complementary things to think about as we approach the internal leadership challenge of sustainability through business and business success through sustainability. But complementing this is really a set of external challenges or systems challenges and approaches towards addressing those. And this picks up on Knut's 4th critical area of systems leadership and systems transformation. And the challenge here, as we've already heard a little bit about in the first 2 sets of comments, is to collaborate with quite diverse stakeholders. And I've pictured here on the slide a wide array of organizations across sectors engaged in climate finance activities. And some of these are radical activists like Extinction Rebellion, and others are collections of investors and funds. And still others are NGOs, quasi-government entities, etc. And all have a role to play. Some are highlighting the problem. Some are operationalizing new ways of addressing the problem through networks of investors. And some are orchestrating, connecting, weaving, and building bridges across sectors, across players and organizations with often seemingly widely varying stances, interests, power bases, and resources. And we need this whole collection of different kinds of approaches and different sectors to solve the problem ahead. But as we know from a long line of research and organization studies, that kind of collaboration is exceedingly difficult because we're coming with different value systems, often different sets of practices and ways of solving problems, and we now need to be in dialogue. And that's the systems leadership challenges that firms face, that startups face as central players in this systemic problem and an approach to a systemic solution. And I want to close by highlighting some of the ways we can think about starting to foster what I call catalytic collaborations that really take us forward, right? Because we need expansive, accelerating action, and we need it now. The first is we need a shared narrative, right? We need a shared way of seeing the problem. We've got many different ways of talking about the climate crisis, many different terms and concepts that we use, and we need something that brings people together and that's motivating, that will motivate individuals to shift behaviors, that will motivate firms as well. The second is we need to create trust. We need to create trust between activists and firms and business, between those in the global north and those in the global south, resource rich and resource poor environments, etc. And then we need the accountability piece. And I think this is where we come full circle to Kamir's opening comments. We need the incentives, but we really need the accountability. And a lot of that can come from governments, but it's not limited to governments. So 3 strategies to think about as we move forward in leading the challenge, not just within firms, but across the entire system of organizations, firms, governments, NGOs, and the individual citizens towards climate leadership. I'll stop there. We're going to open it up now to your questions. I'm seeing a few have already come in the chat. And I'd like to start with a question back to Kamir and Knut about where you are seeing successful collaborations between business and government, in particular in light of the possibility that we risk potentially some co-optation or capture, right? So we want collaboration, but in a way that serves all of our interests, not just those of the most influential firms engaged. Any thoughts on that from the 2 of you?
Kamir, do you want to go first?
Should I jump in? So Knut will like this. And as a Swede, I should not admit it, but Norway is a great example. And it's not just business and government, but it's also business, government, and household. And why is it a great example? Well, because if you look at Norway, most new cars sold are electric. In fact, I think probably has the highest penetration of EVs. And there is nothing optimal about having EVs in Norway, very long distances between homes and businesses and places in general. So the question is, how did Norway really do this, and what can the rest of us do it too? And part of that was basically taxing cars that are with combustible engine or conventional cars, and rewarding those holding electric vehicles, but also incentivizing firms and households by putting out charging points pretty much everywhere. So I think Norway is a great example. And it's an extreme, obviously, as you said, there's a difference between emerging and poor and advanced economies. But in advanced economies, where, if you look at it, top 50% of pollution and emissions in the world is from the top 10% to top 10 percentile in terms of richest economies, which basically means that the bottom 50% are emitting less, 90% of the emissions are top 10%, which means that poor economies don't have the facilities to do that. But in advanced economies, certainly we can do, and Norway is a great example.
Yeah, and thank you, Kamir. And I always ask my friends whether they think my Norwegian friends are more sustainability oriented than my Swiss friends, and of course they're not, even though my Norwegian friends all have electric cars. It's a question of incentives. It's not a question of sustainability mindset, and that's what we have to build in, in different industries in different regions as well. I just want to make 2 points. We need to mobilize startups here. So we need to get new startup companies up and going, and I think that's the big job to be done. If I look at sort of European Green Deal, it should be about bringing up and scaling new technologies. That's one point. Second is, and I think I see a question here on this emerging economies, emerging markets. The best sustainability stories in the world are in emerging markets. They're not in developed markets. They're sustainability solutions built through constraints. And I was part of a project with the WEF a few years ago, and we looked at 1,000 sustainability companies in emerging markets, and we found beautiful stories. And I think that's important here, because it's not just about this using technology to create future solutions. It's very much about constraints driving local innovation as well. We shouldn't be thinking of this as a kind of developed markets issue. It's the issues are bigger in developing markets on average, and the creativity is bigger, and the success stories are more important, in my opinion.
Thank you both. Related question, Knut, you talked about the importance of startups and new ventures, and there's a question on this that builds on from Bob who asks about, what advice might you have for startups and innovators working in this space?
So I'll start, and then Kamir, I'm sure you want to build on it because you've studied this, the whole technology side of it. So the advice I would have is, first of all, observation. New startups today are a lot more greener than new startups were on average 10 years ago or 20 years ago. New startups today are on average greener than established companies today. So there's a positive trend here. Startups are an important part of the solution. First point. Second point is startups are really important for established companies. They are the real innovation engine of big companies as well, because the model for how to drive kind of green strategies is very much about scanning the world for relevant opportunities on behalf of the big companies. So my advice would be think of yourself as a potential part of bigger solutions that can help you scale, because that's the real issue for all startups. How do we scale? And I think many small companies can do a much better job in scaling by teaming up, getting in collaboration with bigger companies as well. But you are part of the solution, in my opinion, an underestimated, really important part of fundamentally addressing climate.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think what for instance, if we look at the solar or renewable energy revolution basically shows us is that many of these products that come out of it were actually too expensive. I mean, you couldn't use them. And it goes sort of the other way as well, that traditional firms, when they scale up, so if you think about solar PVs, when it starts scaling up, there is a big demand, there is more deployment means prices start falling, then has a spillover effect into other markets. And one of those is basically for startups, where they can use these technologies to create sort of amazing new solutions in terms of both green and creating employment. So in other words, the fact that it becomes competitive in new markets is driven by having these traditional or bigger, larger scale businesses. So it goes both ways, and then these new techs then feed into those traditional. So yeah, I mean, I think I couldn't agree more with Knut that the biggest things are happening actually in emerging markets.
Okay, thank you. Another question coming in from Marie-Pierre Seyfried from HEC Paris, who's asking about the role of regenerative economy and how important that should be in achieving a sustainable transition. Any comments on that from either of you?
So I'll say a couple of words and just as an intro. I think, for me, regenerative economy is part of this kind of, we can call it regenerative economy, we can call it circular economy. It's two sides of the same coin. But I guess what regenerative economy points to, which is really important, is the link between biodiversity and climate. So we can't address climate change in isolation. It is really a biodiversity / climate change challenge. The root cause of the one is actually the solution to the other. So we need to address them together. That's on the global level. For firms, it's the same thing. Some companies get at this through the lens of regenerative, and I mentioned DSM. Others get at this through the lens of circular. It's really the same mindset, and I think that's what's important on a macro level, but also on a firm level.
Okay, thank you. I'm noticing also there's a nice exchange in the chat, building on Marie-Pierre's comment, which is, a question about the importance of economic growth, which she raised, and at the same time, coming in from Comrade, the recognition that, the importance of economic growth really varies across different parts of the world, and reminding us to think about the view from lower and middle income segments in developed countries as compared to the view from other parts of the world. So thank you for chiming in on that, and I encourage you to continue to build that discussion in the Q&A. I want to turn to a different topic now, which is the question of digital and digital assets. And there's a question coming in about the importance or the impact of digital assets on climate change. Do we need to build a sustainable Web 3.0 ecosystem, perhaps? Any comments on that?
What do you think?
Please go ahead.
You're nodding. You think you know?
No, I don't know the answer. The only thing I would say for certain is we should not be thinking of kind of AI, digital, the technologies on one side and addressing climate change on the other side. These are totally integrated solutions. So when we look back at hopefully having solved climate in time, or at least faster than we see it today, I think what we'll be surprised by is actually our ability to use technologies to do this. And of course, I mean, COVID is just a small example of the same phenomenon. It's integral. And we've been doing this study of 50 companies that have been successful over 50 years. What are they focused on? And there are just two things they're focused on today: digital and AI and sustainability. Those are common across all the companies, and they are not two disconnected topics. They're two totally integrated topics. So that's the way I think about that.
Actually, can I just go back, and it's related to this, go back to something that Conrad also mentioned was, and also we talked about it, we said there are a lot of opportunities and possibilities in emerging market economies, but there's a huge heterogeneity within that group. And tech is a very important part of the solution, I think. But actually, and in poorer developing countries even more, but having access to these technologies is really key. And we and advanced economies can make a huge impact by transferring knowledge, know-how, but also capital to basically implement these technologies. Because some things are really, I mean, the sort of the low-hanging fruits is I think transportation. This is something that we can decarbonize fairly, not in air, but on ground. We can, and maybe not on sea, but on the ground, we can decarbonize. But actually, these technologies and access to these technologies are not available in many of the low-income countries. And just to give you a scale of the sort of transformation, not just in transportation, but in general, to decarbonize, to reach net zero by 2050, we need something between $40 trillion investments to something about $90 trillion. So it's not a small task, but we have a really important role to play. And I think that's what Conrad is trying to say, is that we really have to transfer know-how and capital from advanced to emerging, and we haven't solved that. So to give an example, COP26 talks about 100 billion a year. 100 billion in a year is a decimal point in what we sort of need. So yeah.
I'm with you, and the way I think about the big topic here is I think we all know where this is going to end. We will have to get to a net zero, circular, renewable type of economy. The question is when.
Yeah.
So the real question is, how fast can we do this, and how can we do it in a as socially considerate way as possible, right? From a global perspective. That's the only question. We will get to it because we will have to get to it. The question is really, can we get to it faster than we're heading now, and can we get to it in a more fair way than it looks like today? And I think this kind of emerging markets, they should have access to all the technologies that we can develop and be part of them, and they will develop as well. But I mean, this kind of sharing of technology for me seems like a very important part of accelerating.
I completely agree. It's a no-brainer. And when we should reach net zero? Well, it should be yesterday. No, not quite. But but the problem is, as you pointed out with startups, and as others have pointed out about startups, is that we really need investments. So investments need to happen today to facilitate this transition in 30 years' time. So if we want to reach net zero 2050, we actually need to start doing stuff straight away. And it's not just, again, us sitting here in rich economies, but we have to facilitate that for everybody. But I suppose it's the problem is that COVID is a good example where we have this technology, the vaccine, but we just don't have the infrastructure or the facilities to try. So we need to really invest in the infrastructure and the facilities to be able to transfer these technologies. And I think we talk a lot about it in certain circles, but policymakers, they always think like throwing money at it is going to solve the problem. And while incentives are good, sort of global incentives are sort of needed too. In other words, we have local, we need global.
Yeah. And Mariah, can I just add, I agree, and just add one comment, because you mentioned this topic of growth, and it's the most complicated topic of all related to climate change. Is it going to happen because we accept to have lower growth, or is it going to force us to lower growth? And I don't really know the answer to that part of it, but I'm pretty sure if it de-average the economy, some parts of the economy are actually going to decline enormously. Other parts are going to grow incredibly over the next 2 decades. So the big question of growth, I can't really answer because I don't know the outcome of that, but I do know that some industries are going to grow massively and they are going to get the investments. The question, Kamir, I agree with you, is how fair is that investment going to be from a global perspective, and how much is it going to be in the short term? It needs to be much, much bigger investments than we are seeing today. But there are signs of optimism as well, I would say.
Absolutely, and the fact that we are decoupling, I think Marie-Pierre was mentioning, is a good sign, because it implies that we still can have the growth, even if you take into account the carbon footprint of products. We still, in the UK, for instance, we are decoupling. And what that means is that we still can have growth and have environmental benefits. But you're right, there will be massive opportunities for certain firms, and certain industries will not be around anymore. We will have stranded assets.
Yeah.
You've highlighted, I think, one of the key challenges, which is the unevenness of this, right? There will be winners and losers. It's not evenly distributed, and really important issues to pay attention to. It's not just across industries. We have to think about across regions, different countries of the world, and so on. And there aren't any easy answers, as you've said, but the questions need to be asked, and the conversation needs to continue. I want to shift us to one topic that we touched on a little bit, but not explicitly, which is the role of individuals, right? And what can we do as individuals to motivate, to push for the kinds of changes in policy that you've talked about, the kinds of business transformations that you've talked about, and through our own individual behavior? What role can we play? Should we be playing?
I mean, we are already playing, right? And I'm with Knut. I'm very optimistic, because actually, my kids come to me and talk to me about carbon footprints of various products. When I was their age, I had no idea what carbon footprint meant, So, and they are driving, I think they are really in the driving seat of this. And these guys are going to be the new people. They're the generation that will come and vote for politicians. So in a way, they're already driving and creating this transformation, I think. And they're also doing it so in terms of consumers, are also investors, and investors are going into shareholder meetings, AGMs, and pushing companies and pushing the boards to think about their strategy. And then I think the final bit is individuals are consumers, and if the generation that is the current generation, the young generation that is coming up, and they're going to want to buy goods and services, they're going to go for this sort of clean and green goods and services. So I think that's key. And from firms' point of view, recruitment and retention is going to be very difficult. If you're a firm which is not sort of high on the environment agenda, I think you find it difficult to retain and to recruit talent. So I think you are spot on. Individual action, even though it's very small, but if you aggregate it, it's quite massive.
Yeah, and I'll just make one observation on leadership. I think the days are over when leaders can say that they're doing some big good things and then they allow themselves to do some small bad things. Yeah. I think that's not okay anymore. We have to actually start with what we do as individuals. And I can just see that, for example, with our MBA students, when we talked about, we did this huge COP simulation, etc. They're interested in the practical things. What kind of cars are there in the faculty garage? Do they have air conditions on at the COP meetings, etc.? I think we're at a time when we can't point to others. We actually have to point to ourselves. That's where it starts. And once we do that, we will actually drive the right kind of actions as well. So, Mariah, I think the question is really important. It starts with us, this one.
Thank you, Knut, and thank you, Kamir, as well. Really, I think a wonderful place to end our conversation, which is, it does start with us. We're stepping up. We especially see the next generation stepping up, and we need to continue. We need to continue to push that in our own behavior and in what we're demanding of the places where we work, the governments in which we participate, the societies and communities in which we participate. Thanks again for your engagement.
Thank you, Mariah. Thank you, Kamir. It was great to get to know you through this discussion and the preps as well.
Thank you very much, guys.